At 11:32 on the morning of November 29, 1943, American heavy bombers were already turning away from Bremen, if they were still in one piece. That day, the 8th Air Force sent a 154 heavy bombers toward the target. 13 did not come back. Those numbers look clean on paper. Sorties launched, tons dropped, aircraft missing. But inside the aluminum tubes over northern Germany, the arithmetic was not abstract. It was personal. 10 men per bomber, most of them young, most of them on oxygen at 24,000 feet, watching black flak bursts bloom like ink in the sky. Somewhere on that route home, one B-17 broke apart in midair. Its tail section separated and fell, still occupied by a gunner who had no business surviving what happened next. Most retellings frame the story as a miracle, a triumph of will. But if you zoom out, what you see is something colder, and in some ways more disturbing. This is what it looked like when a strategic system accepted unsustainable losses as the price of learning, and when a single crewman's survival became memorable mainly because so many others vanished without a story. Tonight, we're not chasing the legend. We're tracing the machinery behind it. How doctrine, technology, escort limitations, and German defenses combined to make late 1943 the most punishing phase of the American daylight bomber campaign. And why the men in the tail were often the first to die. American air planners entered the war with an idea that seemed both modern and humane. Precision over area destruction, daylight visibility over night bombing, and self-defending formations that could fight their way to the target and back. The B-17 Flying Fortress was built around that promise: durability, altitude performance, and a ring of defensive 50 caliber guns meant to make fighter attacks too expensive to sustain. The theory became a geometry problem. Bombers would fly in tight boxes, arranged so multiple aircraft could cover each other's blind spots. A fighter closing from one angle would be exposed to several guns at once. The bomber stream would become a moving fortress wall, enough firepower to deter interception, enough altitude to reduce flak accuracy, enough bombs to break industry. But by the second half of 1943, the campaign's statistics were forcing a harder truth into the open. The geometry was real, but so were the casualties. Crews were expected to complete a tour of 25 missions to go home. In 1943, only about a quarter made it to the end of that requirement. That isn't a motivational problem. It's an attrition equation. Even when losses were only 5% on a given mission, the compounding effect across weeks and months was brutal. And in late 1943, losses often spiked beyond what any long-term air campaign could comfortably absorb. The 8th Air Force didn't stop. It couldn't. Strategic bombing was not a sideshow. It was a central pressure point on Germany, competing with every other demand for aircraft, fuel, crews, and time. So the system kept flying while it learned, and the learning curve was written in missing aircraft. If you want a single date that captures the mood, it's October 14th, 1943. Schweinfurt. A deep raid that cost 60 B-17s destroyed and 17 damaged beyond repair. A blow so severe the date acquired its own name. Black Thursday. By the end of November, the campaign was still pushing, because doctrine and necessity were louder than fear. And in that environment, the men who sat alone at the very back of the bomber were not just gunners. They were the system's exposure point. The B-17 carried a crew of 10, distributed like organs in a body, pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, navigator and bombardier forward, flight engineer and top turret behind them, radio operator amidships, waist gunners at open windows, ball turrets suspended below, and then the tail gunner, 40 feet behind the others, separated by fuselage and noise, watching the most dangerous direction in the sky. 6 o'clock. German fighter pilots learned quickly what the bomber formations did and didn't protect. Attacks from dead astern offered a narrow but deadly advantage. Only one defender could reliably engage them at the most critical moment, especially if the approach was low and fast, and the fighter pilot was disciplined. In the medical and operational records, one pattern kept repeating across heavy bomber units. Some stations were simply worse to occupy. The tail and ball turret were particularly hazardous. A U.S. Army medical history volume on aircrew wounds notes that fatal casualty rates were highest for gunners in the ball turret and tail positions. That wasn't because those men lacked courage or skill. It was because their physical location intersected with enemy tactics, where you sat determined which threats you absorbed first. The tail gunner also faced a quieter vulnerability: isolation. If the intercom failed, he might not know who was wounded, which engines were out, or whether the aircraft was about to bail out, until the moment the bomber's structure told him directly. And there was one more detail that mattered in a firefight: the parachute. Tail gunners wore chest packs, practical for the cramped station, but exposed. If cannon shells shredded the pack, the last resort vanished before the moment it was needed. None of this was romantic. It was engineering and tactics colliding. Now place a 19-year-old in that seat and send him toward Bremen. Bremen mattered. Shipyards, industrial works, a major node in the German war economy, valuable enough to justify repeated raids, defended heavily enough to make every raid a gamble. On November 29, 1943, the 8th Air Force's mission against Bremen was large, but weather and mechanical realities meant not every aircraft reached the target. The U.S. Army Air Force's combat chronology records that 154 heavy bombers attacked, while more than 200 aborted because of clouds and equipment trouble. This is the part of strategic bombing the public rarely sees. The mission begins breaking down before the first flak burst. Aircraft turn back. Formations thin. Stragglers emerge not only from damage, but from navigation error, engine problems, or weather that destroys cohesion. But the formations that reached Bremen still had to do the most dangerous thing a bomber can do: fly straight. Precision bombing required stability. The bomb run demanded a steady platform, not evasive weaving. Even if flak was walking toward you in timed bursts, the aircraft stayed on course while the bombardier watched the sight. And then, after bombs away, the mission was not over. It was only shifting phase. Because the return route was where damaged aircraft died, a bomber with an engine out bleeds speed. A bomber bleeding speed falls behind its box. A bomber outside the box loses the defensive geometry that doctrine depended on. And German fighter controllers understood the system's weaknesses as well as the Americans did. Their job was to isolate the weak unit and crush it. Somewhere in that sky, one B-17, B-17F, 42, 30359, Ricky Tikitavi of the 96th Bomb Group was hit hard enough that it never made it back. The legend begins here. But the system's story begins earlier, in the decisions that made such legends inevitable. 1830-2630. The critical moment. When the box fails, the bomber becomes prey. A lone B-17 is not a fortress. It is a target. German fighter tactics by late 1943 were evolved, professional, and increasingly specialized. Fighters did not have to destroy an aircraft outright in the first pass. They could do something more efficient. Take away its ability to stay with the formation. Engines were prime targets, so were gun positions. Eliminate enough defensive fire, and the approach lanes open. The bomber's gunners fought back with everything they had: training, reflex, teamwork. But the system expected them to do something almost impossible: maintain a stable defensive pattern while under attack, at altitude, in sub-zero air, while oxygen masks iced and gloves stiffened. This is where popular accounts often narrow into heroism, because heroism is visible. But the larger reality is that the bomber offensive was still trying to solve a set of problems in real time. Escort fighters often lacked the range to stay with bombers deep into Germany until long-range coverage improved later. Defensive gun coverage was strong in theory but could be overwhelmed in practice. Flak was not a background hazard. It was an industrial-scale killing mechanism guarding targets like Bremen. When a bomber began losing speed, the timeline shortened dramatically. Every minute behind the formation increased the chance that fighters would commit to repeated attacks, not just harassment. The Milk Run myth, if it ever existed, didn't survive contact with German air defense, and at some point in that storm, Rikki-Tikki-Tavi suffered a catastrophic failure. Accounts describe the aircraft breaking apart, with the tail section separating while still occupied. Some details vary across retellings, and the exact mechanics, where the structural failure began, which hits triggered it, whether a prior flak strike weakened the airframe, are difficult to reconstruct with perfect certainty from surviving documentation. What can be said confidently is that the aircraft was lost on this mission and did not return, consistent with the day's recorded loss figures. This is the moment where the miracle narrative usually takes over. A tail gunner in a falling section of aircraft, a parachute that may no longer be usable, and the ground 4 miles below. But if we keep our original lens, the system, not the legend, the meaning of that moment changes. Because what happened next was not merely a man refusing to die. A human body in free fall accelerates quickly. With air resistance, terminal velocity is commonly cited around 120 miles per hour, fast enough that impact is almost always fatal. Aircraft wreckage changes the equation. A separated tail section presents large surface area, irregular shapes, and stabilizers that can create drag and, in some circumstances, a crude gliding effect. Instead of a clean vertical plunge, the descent can become a violent, tumbling fall that sheds speed unpredictably. That does not make it safe. It makes it possible, in the same way that a coin landing on its edge is possible. There are other documented cases in World War II history of airmen surviving extreme falls without effective parachutes, typically because wreckage or terrain reduced impact forces. The existence of those cases tells us something important. Survival can occur even when probability says no, but it remains rare and heavily dependent on circumstance, not intention. This matters because it reframes the legend. Courage is real. Determination is real. But neither can negotiate with gravity. The real determinant in these survivals is the chain of physical accidents. How the wreckage falls, what it hits first, what absorbs energy, what breaks away, and what remains intact long enough to protect the occupant. If the tail section struck trees before the ground, if it tore through branches and bled speed, if the final impact was partially cushioned, those are the kinds of factors that decide whether a body survives. And if the man inside is 19, with a body that can endure shock, blood loss, and trauma better than an older one might, then the odds shift slightly, though never comfortably. But here's the key point for the documentary we're making. A survival story like this becomes famous partly because it is so abnormal. For every wreckage fall that turned into a miracle, there were hundreds of aircraft that simply detonated, or disintegrated, or hit the ground at full speed, leaving nothing survivable, endo-narrative beyond missing. The system produced far more disappearances than miracles, and the system kept flying anyway. If an airman survived the fall, the next question was often simpler and more frightening. Who found him? Downed bomber crews landed in a Germany that had been bombed repeatedly, with civilians digging bodies out of rubble and watching factories burn. Sympathy was not guaranteed, and the Luftwaffe's war was increasingly defensive, increasingly bitter. Some airmen were protected by military custody. Others encountered civilians first. Outcomes varied widely depending on location, timing, and the discipline of local authorities. Wounded prisoners were sometimes moved through improvised medical holding facilities before reaching more stable POW hospitals. The quality of care could range from competent to minimal, depending on staff and supplies, both of which were deteriorating as the war went on and Germany's medical system strained under bombing, front casualties, and shortages. This is where many accounts introduce figures like foreign doctors, captured medical personnel, or overworked German surgeons making triage decisions under impossible constraints. Some stories can be corroborated. Others are hard to audit cleanly without unit medical logs that did not always survive. What can be stated confidently is the structural reality. By late 1943, Germany's ability to provide consistent medical care, even to its own people, was under pressure, and prisoners fell below German wounded in priority. So if a severely injured airman survived long enough to stabilize, it was often because a chain of human decisions, doctors choosing to try, guards choosing not to interfere, administrators allowing scarce supplies to be used, aligned in his favor. Not because the system was designed to help him, but because individuals inside the enemy system sometimes acted beyond what the system required. This is a grim symmetry. The bomber offensive relied on individuals to keep a strained doctrine functioning, and survival behind the wire often relied on individuals to override a collapsing bureaucracy. By 1944 and early 1945, the prisoner of war system across Germany and occupied territory became increasingly unstable. Allied advances from west and east meant camps that were once secure were suddenly in the path of armies. German authorities moved prisoners not out of mercy, but control, to avoid liberation by advancing forces, to preserve leverage, to keep prisoners from becoming intelligence assets. In that endgame, evacuations were frequent, and conditions worsened. The most notorious feature of this period was the forced marching of prisoners in winter, movement on foot because rail lines were damaged, fuel was scarce, and the German state was literally being torn apart. The UK National Archives summarizes the wider phenomenon starkly. As Allied forces advanced, German authorities forced around 80,000 prisoners onto marches in harsh conditions. Around 8,000 died, and responsibility was later treated as a war crime at Nuremberg. Specific marches vary by camp and route, and precise death counts for any one column can be difficult to confirm, especially where records were lost or never kept reliably. But the pattern is clear. Late war prisoner movement was not administrative. It was survival under collapse. Men already weakened by malnutrition and disease were pushed across frozen roads. Some were shot for falling behind. Others died of exposure, pneumonia, or dysentery. Many simply disappeared into the chaos of a state that could no longer control its own borders. If the air war's early phase was about industrial capacity, the late phase was about entropy. And entropy kills as effectively as bullets. Now we return to the question we started with. If one airman survived an impossible fall, what does that actually tell us? It does not prove that willpower conquers physics. It tells us something more historically useful. The bomber offensive in late 1943 operated beyond comfortable loss margins. The campaign continued while it was still solving escort, tactics, and formation problems because strategic necessity outweighed sustainability in the short term. The statistic that only about 25% completed a 25-mission tour in 1943 makes the human cost legible. Certain crew positions absorbed disproportionate risk. Tail and ball turret gunners were not merely brave, they were structurally exposed, and the casualty patterns reflect that. Mission outcomes were shaped by friction as much as by enemy action. Weather and equipment failures caused hundreds of aborts, even on major missions like Bremen, thinning formations and creating vulnerabilities before fighters ever closed. When the protective geometry failed, survival became lottery-level rare. A bomber outside its formation wasn't just in danger. It was effectively a condemned aircraft awaiting the moment the enemy decided to finish the job. In that light, the famous survival becomes a data point, not a comforting one, because it highlights the scale of what was happening around it. A system that produces legends does so because it also produces graves. The United States and its allies ultimately solved many of the bomber offensive's hardest problems. Long-range escort improved, fighter tactics evolved, German defenses were worn down, pulled apart by multiple fronts, starved of fuel and experienced pilots. The strategic air campaign contributed to Germany's defeat through disruption, diversion, and cumulative destruction. But the learning was paid for in crews, and the men at the back of the bombers often paid first. That is why this story still matters. Not because it is inspirational, though it can be. It matters because it forces a moral and historical question that sits beneath every industrial war. When a doctrine demands a certain rate of loss, who absorbs the bill? The answer in late 1943 was young airmen, gunners, many barely out of training, sitting alone behind a wall of glass and aluminum, told that formation firepower would protect them. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. And when it didn't, the world shrank to a few seconds of violence, then either silence or a miracle that only became famous because so few were granted one. In the end, the story is not only about a gunner and a fall. It's about a system that kept flying while it figured out how not to bleed itself dry. And about the people inside that system who had no choice but to endure the learning curve, one mission at a time.